Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Christopher Manfredi, and I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Arts at McGill University and a Professor of Political Science. And it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you this evening to the 2011 Cundill Prize Awards ceremony. McGill University is this year celebrating its 190th anniversary of providing one of the finest post-secondary educations in the world. I have two functions tonight. The first is to serve as your host and the person who is going to try to keep the proceedings moving at a good clip. And the second is I'm going to try to serve as the live tweeter of this event. So if you see me playing with my BlackBerry under the table, I'm not being rude. I'm trying to broadcast the event to my at least dozens of followers around the world. But I'm very happy to be here in celebration of the fourth Cundill Prize, a prize that is still in many ways in its infancy, but that remains the largest nonfiction historical literature prize in the world. The prize, of course, awards three significant monetary awards, two Recognition of Excellence awards, each at a value of $10,000 US, and a grand prize of $75,000 US. The Cundill Prize was established to recognize authors who have published books determined to have a profound literary, social, and academic impact on their subjects. A particular emphasis in the jury is placed on well-written books that contribute to knowledge that can be read and understood by experts, but that are also appealing to informed readers alike. At McGill, we are very grateful to Peter Cundill for his vision in creating this prize and for the funding that he also provided for the Cundill Fellowships in the Department of History at McGill University. These fellowships have already been put to good use in supporting several graduate students in the department. Peter was born and educated in Montreal. He earned a Bachelor of Commerce degree from McGill University in 1960, after which he qualified as a chartered accountant and entered the investment business. In 1963, he began to keep daily journals that he maintained for more than 40 years as he built and grew the Cundill Value Fund, for which he became famous. He lived in London for the past 20 years, and I'm told he loved this city. Peter was a voracious reader. His passion for history and his belief that it is only possible to comprehend the present and arrive at a measured perspective about the future if one understands the past led to his establishment of the Cundill Prize. In 2006, Peter was diagnosed with an untreatable neurological condition. He wanted to provide some legacy of his investment genius, which might be useful to others, and this culminated in the production of a book, There's Always Something to Do, the Peter Cundill Investment Approach. I'm grateful to Philip Cerconi at the McGill Queen's University Press for having donated a copy of the book to each of you. We're also pleased that Christopher Risso-Gill, who the book's author, is here with us this evening and has signed the books for you. Christopher Risso-Gill was a friend of Peter's for 35 years. He was on his investment board for 12 years and worked closely on this book with Peter on a daily basis for over 2 years, and I hope you enjoy it. Although we had hoped that Peter would be able to attend this year's Cundill Prize Award ceremony in London, sadly he passed away in January. His spirit is with us this evening, and I will ask his dear friend Michael Meehan to say a few words in his honor in a moment. But first, I want to say that the Cundill Prize has given the Faculty of Arts a wonderful opportunity to search the world for a few outstanding authors in the field of historical nonfiction. And there are several here that I would like to welcome this evening. First, we are lucky to have two past winners with us this evening. Lisa Jardine, winner of the 2009 award for her book, Going Dutch, How England Plundered Holland's Glory, published by Harper Publishers. Welcome, Lisa. And last year's winner, Durbin McCulloch, author of the book, A History of Christianity, The First 3,000 Years, published by Alan Lane. Welcome, Durbin. And of course, we have this year's three finalists who will all receive a more elaborate introduction later this evening. So I'll just ask them to indicate where they are. Maya Jazanoff for her book, Liberty's Exiles, American Loyalists in the Revolutionary World, or, as it's titled in UK, Liberty's Exiles, The Loss of America and the Remaking of the British Empire. I have to indicate that. Sergio Luzzatto for his book Padre Pio, Miracles and Politics in a Secular Age. And this book was originally published in Italian and was translated into English by Frederica Randall, and Sergio and Frederica are both with us this evening. Sergio is very And finally, Timothy Snyder for his book, Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin. I want to thank this year's Cundill Prize jury for once again selecting an outstanding group of books for the shortlist, which of course this year includes for the first time an author from outside of North America or the United Kingdom. Peter was very much insistent that this be an international prize, and we've always tried to live up to that ideal. The books on this year's list confirm the enduring impact of war, revolution, and religion on people's lives. These events dominate our past, shape our future, and shape our present and condition our future. I would also like to quickly point out this year's advisory committee members. First of all, the friend of Peter Cundill, and of course friend of McGill, Michael Meehan, or Michael is here with us today. McGill alumna Elizabeth Gomery, who is also joining us today from Montreal. She's in the back there. And partner at the New York law firm Simpson, Thacher, Ryerson, Simons, who is joining us here from Toronto. Unfortunately, McGill's Professor Emeritus in History Myron Eckenberg and Ken White, the Vice President of Rogers Publishing, could not join us tonight. It is, of course, always dangerous for a host to mention some but not all of the people in the room, but I do want to point out a few individuals who are with us today. First of all, I'd like to welcome the Canadian High Commissioner to the United Kingdom, Gordon Campbell, and his wife Nancy, who are with us today, and welcome them to the new post in London. Thank you for being with us. John and Janet Blatchford, who are friends of Peter Cundill and wonderful supporters of the Cundill Prize since its creation. John and Janet are with us this evening. Thank you, John and Janet, for being with us. John Zucchi, Chair of the Department of History at McGill University. John is with us tonight. And finally, the Director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada, whose team organizes the Cundill Prize, Will Straw, is with us tonight. And I want to thank all of them for being here. And in case you didn't notice, I would like to mention that the finalist books, and I'm sure they would like me to mention it too, the finalist books are on sale in the main lobby if you haven't had a chance to pick one up. And please note also that the evening is being videotaped and photographed, and you will see the video as well as the photos in a few weeks on the Cundill Prize website. I would now like to say a few words about Michael Meehan and then invite him to the podium. The Honourable Michael Meehan is a member of the Senate of Canada, a Quebec and Ontario lawyer, and a former chair of the Stratford Shakespeare Festival. He is a member of the Cundill Prize Advisory Committee and former chair of the Cundill Funds. He is the co-chair of McGill University's most ambitious fundraising campaign, which has now reached approximately 85% of its goal. And Senator Meehan received his Bachelor of Arts degree in 1960 from McGill University, which means I suppose I still have some jurisdiction over him. At any rate, Michael, I'd like to invite you to the podium and say a few words about Peter Cundill.
Thanks, Chris. I wish you hadn't mentioned the date of my graduation from McGill. Janet and I like to fool some people if we can, but it's getting increasingly difficult. In any event, thank you, Christopher, for that generous introduction. And on behalf of the Cundill Foundation and my other board members who are present here, Jenny Bingham, entre autres, I want to say how very pleased we are to be here this evening. This is the fourth Cundill Prize dinner, and the first since Peter's death, as Christopher said, last January. So it seems only fitting that it be held here in London, which was the city where he spent the last 20 years of his life and which he loved dearly. In fact, if you read Christopher Riso Gill's book, you'll learn why he ended up in London as opposed to Paris and the motivation behind that decision. And Christopher, you can indicate where the book can be purchased, I'm sure, for those who don't have a free copy on their table. Many of you, of course, knew Peter well over the years on a personal level, and others, though, who are here tonight, perhaps their only association with him is through this prize. So I thought I might say one or two words, a few that haven't already been alluded to by Christopher, about Peter and about the type of individual he was. We grew up together in Montreal. Peter was an avid athlete. We went to different schools until we got together at McGill. And then after Peter had achieved his certified CA degree and his CFA degree, he, as was the fashion in Canada in the late 19th century, or early 20th century, when my grandfather moved west, he too moved west and went to Vancouver to seek his fortune. And fortune he found. He started a very successful venture capital business based on his rigorous analysis of balance sheets and on his rock-solid integrity, and became immensely successful at it. Indeed, he carried on until the very end. And I don't know the details, but I do know that in the last few months of his life, he did extremely well in the Kyrgyzstan bonds. So if any of you are brave, you might consider that way of doing well. I certainly won't. But Peter was a net investor, a disciple of Benjamin Graham, but he was in no sense a one-dimensional man. Springing from his lively and constant curiosity, an openness to new ways of thinking. His interests were really eclectic. He was a voracious reader, as Christopher has mentioned. He read on a wide range of subjects. He was a faithful diarist. He was an inveterate and adventurous traveler, a generous philanthropist, and the successful completer of 22 marathons. Peter relished sports and physical activity of all sorts: tennis, handball, squash, skiing, rugby, hiking. Peter did them all, and did them with enthusiasm and skill. But the iron discipline employed in his professional life was generally replicated in his personal life. Cigars? Yes, but only on Thursdays. Martinis? Yes, but only on Mondays. But Peter's self-discipline did not extend to junk food and ice cream, for which he had an irrepressible craving. And for a long period, Peter used to select a new skill, such as piano playing or skydiving, which he sought to master before his curiosity about the world and life drove him on to the next. I often urged Peter to choose proficiency in French as a goal, but he invariably demurred, insisting that his fluency was entirely adequate and that in any event it grew in direct proportion to the amount of good claret consumed. I was always inclined to agree. Peter had a fascination for history. Some would say that this arose from failing an examination at McGill. And I well remember that because his penance was painting the university's fence along Sherbrooke Street rather than a trip to Europe before he retook and passed the exam. But this trauma apart, the more likely explanation for his fascination and captivation with history was his belief that, Christopher said, he stole my line, the only possible way to comprehend the present and arrive at a measured perspective about the future is if we understand the past. And as a result, he founded in 2008 the Cundill History Prize that we celebrate tonight. And it's designed, I must say, to celebrate the writing not only of high academic standard, but also of high popular readability. Peter was very insistent that he felt that the two could be combined and should be combined. And I know that the jury have always been cognizant of this dual responsibility. Were he with us tonight, I'm entirely confident that he would have been enthralled by the works of our three finalists. And just days before his death, Peter received Christopher Riso Gill's wonderful book, There's Always Something to Do, The Peter Cundill Investment Approach, which will stand as his enduring legacy. Peter's influence will be felt for many years to come through his contributions to the financial world, to the community at large, and most importantly, through the Cundill History Prize. So I'd ask you to join me in a toast to my friend Peter Cundill, a unique and multidimensional individual. Peter. Peter Cundill.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that terrific tribute to Peter, who I had the great fortune of meeting him 3 times in London. Now, perhaps the best news that you will receive all evening. You don't have to hear from me again until after dessert. Enjoy your meal. Thank you. I'm pleased to be back. I'll let you know that I managed to do 3 tweets during dinner, and I picked up 1 new follower, so it's been a great evening. So I've tweeted to 183 followers, and McGill University, hard at work on a Sunday, has retweeted me to the over 12,000 followers that McGill University has. Before I invite Jeff Simpson to start the proceedings in the introduction of our authors and their books, I would like to say a few words about the terrific jury that worked on the prize this year. Unfortunately, Stuart Schwartz, who is also the first Cundill Prize winner, could not be with us tonight. He is a professor in the Department of History at Yale University, and I understand from Timothy Snyder that this is the most intense period at Yale as they come up close to the Thanksgiving break in the United States. Let me say that, first of all, Anthony Carey is here with us this evening, a member of the jury. Anthony is the executive director of the Queen's Blythe Educational Programs and is also a former High Commissioner of the United Kingdom to Canada. So Anthony is here with us, and pleased that he was served on the jury. The Globe and Mail's national affairs columnist and Jeffrey Simpson is here this evening, and he is going to introduce Maya Jazanov's book, Liberty's Exiles. Well-known Indian author and columnist Ramachandra Guha will introduce Sergio Luzato's book, Padre Pio, and Ram currently holds the Philippe Roman Professor of History and International Relations at the London School of Economics. And finally, Catherine Desbarras, a professor of history at McGill University, who is serving her 2nd year on the Cundill jury, will be introducing Timothy Snyder's book, Bloodlands. Now that I've introduced the introducers, I will remind them and the finalists to keep to their allotted 3-minute time slot. The cameras are rolling. We don't want to bore the audience that much. I would ask Ram to come right up after Professor Jazanov speaks, and then Kate to come right after Professor Luzato, and that way I don't have to keep leaving my table to come up to the podium. So I'd like now to introduce Jeff Simpson to come up and introduce Maya Jazanov's book, Liberty's Exiles. Thank you, Jeff.
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the 5 jurors, I'd like to say a few words about Maya Jazanov's Liberty's Exiles. I suspect that for the vast majority of British and American people, the U.S. War of Independence, or the Revolutionary War as it's sometimes called, was a straightforward affair. The British lost, the Americans won, and the United States of America duly appeared as a fledgling country in the world, sovereign, independent, proud, and loud, which it is today. But that conflict, which I suspect neither the British nor the Americans choose to remember, was also a civil war. Many there were in those American colonies who strongly desired to maintain the link with the British Crown. This is not a political occasion. We do not wish to refight those or other wars. So if you wish to keep those comments to yourself, I wish you would. Shall I start that sentence again? Many were those in every one of those American colonies along the eastern seaboard of North America who desired to maintain the British connection. And some of them fought, and some of them died to retain that link. Many were the reasons for their desire to retain that link, but the essential one was that the Crown, as they saw it, the British Crown, as they saw it, offered a certain and better conception of liberty than the one that was on offer from Washington and all those other renegades. The conception of liberty that they had was one that was based on tradition, of course, of order, of hierarchy, of obligation of the crown to its subjects, and vice versa. And they came from every standing of what was then British American society, from what we might call the lowest to the highest. In fact, I think it would shock almost every American to know that that icon of their currency, of their bank, the Franklin Bank, of their Revolutionary period, Benjamin Franklin, had a son who was so firmly committed to the British Crown that he emigrated to Britain, lived here, and never said another word to his father, Benjamin, and vice versa. So you can see that this conflict was a civil conflict as well as a conflict between an empire and a nascent state. And Canadians, with a sense of their own country's history, would know all about the Loyalists in one form or another. They, after all, they flocked to British Canada. In Nova Scotia, Shelburne, Halifax. The whole country from Manitoba east is littered with names that were given to places by Loyalists. They went to Quebec. They went to what is now Ontario. I live in Ottawa. The whole valley is populated by people who, or was populated by people who came from the United States to flee the Revolution. They were a foundation stone of what became Canada. They uprooted themselves in a way that none of us can imagine. They left behind their property. They imperiled their safety. They put their families at risk. They bore awful burdens, all to remain subjects of the British Crown. And they weren't all whites like us, because there were many black, or Negro as they were called then, Americans, who left because of the circumstances in which they found themselves. The Book of Negroes in the New York harbor was to catalog. One of the great fights was between Sir Guy Carleton and George Washington over how many and which blacks would be allowed to leave New York to go to Halifax, the Book of Negroes. And Indians, as we don't call them anymore, but many of them sided with the British. They were on the losing side. They came to what is now Canada and settled there. Who were they? Why did they remain so steadfast? What could have possessed them to hold this attachment to a losing cause? And it's their story that Maya Jasanoff's outstanding book, Liberty's Exiles, is all about. And I love the title. I love it because I don't know whether they thought of it this way or maybe it's just my imagination, but it was double entendre, because they were not only exiles from liberty in the sense of how the Americans at that time defined liberty, but they were also exiles in the sense that they were fleeing to find what they considered to be a different and better conception of liberty. And what makes Liberty's Exile so exciting for all the members of the juries was that it is not only revealing from the point of view of those of us in this room, in the transatlantic world, but most of us didn't know that these exiles went to Florida, which was then not British, and they went to the Caribbean, and they came back to Britain, where they weren't fish or fowl. They were Her Majesty's subjects who'd given so much, but for the British, who were these people? They hadn't lived here. They weren't part of us. And then they went to Sierra Leone, imagine, to Africa, the Negro exiles, and formed a colony in Sierra Leone, and a few went on to India and other places. So this was a kaleidoscopic story which Maya Jasanoff has described, but it's more than a description because it's an analysis of what that defeat in that war meant to the British Empire and how these individuals sort of incarnated that defeat and caused the British Empire to reflect profoundly upon how it should run the empire in the post-defeat period. And that reflection produced significant changes in the thinking about how to run an empire that went on for a very, very long period of time. A new approach to running an empire. So this is history on a grand scale, across various continents and many years. But it is leavened by many individual stories of people captured in events over which they thought they had control, but ultimately had none. It's full of fascinating people whose worlds were turned upside down, and it merits being on our short list. Thank you.
Well, let me say first just what an incredible honor it is to be here tonight. You know, when you write a book about losers, you don't really expect to be in this remarkable position. And it's particularly wonderful to be part of a celebration of international history, which has some particularly strong resonances for me personally, which I'll come to in a moment. As Jeffrey's introduction suggested, Liberty's Exiles really seeks to understand what a world historical moment looks and feels like when you're somebody caught up within it. And we're living in a moment now, for example, where many of us sense incredible global change, but few of us can predict with any certainty where these changes will take us. And so I think this is so much the more reason that we need to look at past moments of turbulence and understand their human contours. Now, people often ask me, why has this story not been told before? And I have two answers to this. The first one is that history is, of course, as we know, the famous cliche tells us, written by the winners. And by histories are entrenched in national traditions in the modern age. And we tend, as a result of this, to forget how very different history can appear depending on where you stand. And again, now more than ever, I think we really feel the limits of our national narratives, and we feel our global interconnections that much more in every headline, for better and worse. And I think we need to revisit some of these national historical moments to think about them differently. I would add, too, that the profession of history really came of age in tandem with the nation state as a way of helping to mold national citizens. But today, as we recognize ourselves to be citizens of the world, having a global history, a history that is sensitive to international connections, becomes that much more important. And globalization has also made it much easier to tell these stories. And this is the second reason I think people haven't written this kind of global history of loyalist refugees before. Sources are scattered. When people scatter around the world, they take their papers with them, and those end up all around the world. But now, thanks to the internet, among other things, and civil aviation being recently at least fairly low cost, it has become much easier to piece together these kinds of transcontinental histories. I would add to this the fact that now at the touch of a button in your living room, you can access incredible rare sources. You can turn up connections among archives on multiple continents. And together, this digital technology has a wonderfully sort of democratizing effect on who can do history and how. And I am very conscious in having written this history that I am a product of Western well-funded institutions and have had exceptional privilege, but I can only hope that the digital age will mean history is doable and accessible by many, many more around the world. Now, the Loyalist refugees moved around a vast amount of the world, as you've just heard, and it was a very large one. Yet, while writing this book, I was repeatedly struck by the interconnections in these lives and how very small a world, in many ways, this was. And this brings me to just a final point. I grew up in upstate New York on Iroquois land, about 150 miles or so away from the Canadian border. But I fell in love with history by traveling far away, imaginatively through reading novels, mostly European novels, and also through traveling quite literally with my family to many parts of the world, most particularly here in Britain and my mother's native India. So I became a historian of Britain and the British Empire, partly thanks to these kinds of influences. Yet as I worked on the history of the British world, I remembered back to that Iroquois land in upstate New York, not so far from the Canadian border. And I realized that maybe where I came from was linked into what I cared about in much deeper and more profound ways. And so the results are what you see in this kind of entangling of British and American and Canadian histories. So finally, it has special personal significance for me, therefore, to be part of this wonderful recognition of international history under the auspices of a distinguished Canadian university, myself, of course, from the United States, with many others from the US and other parts of the world, and here in London, the center of it all. And so I want to thank some of the people who have made this possible, including my friend Kirk Swinehart, who's pointing a camera at me at this moment, who introduced me to the Iroquois Loyalists, and also to my editor, Arabella Pike, a friend and editor who has helped me in many ways, and of course to the other publishers not with me here tonight. So to conclude, what a great honor, of course, and a terrific testament, really, to the enduring power and importance, I think, of international histories and all of the people who help support them and make them happen.
When several weeks ago, my fellow jury members nominated me to introduce Sergio Lusato's book, I wondered why. And on the flight from Montreal to London, I decided it was because the most powerful person in my homeland, India, is of Italian origin. But taking the tube to the function today, I realized that there's now a second reason, that given the state Italy is in now, they might do worse than get an Indian to become the most powerful person in Italy. Italy and India share much in common, apart from the exchange of past and future political leaders, and one is a certain flamboyance in their intellectual traditions. Sergio is a historian who wants to become a columnist. I'm a columnist who wants to become a historian. We both, in common with our compatriots, are much more comfortable with the spoken word than the written word. We operate in the oral tradition. We are great bullshitters. And this was confirmed when about 10 minutes ago, 15 minutes ago, Sergio leaned out to me and said, "Do you have a written text?" And the flamboyant Italian did not want to admit that he had a written text. And he was somewhat comforted and relieved and surprised to find that I, the even more recklessly flamboyant Indian, had a written text. And then I told him, I said, look, Sergio, the problem is this. If you ask me or you to speak for an hour, we don't need a text. But if you ask us to speak for 3 minutes precisely, then we need a text. So here goes. Mahatma Gandhi once said that while his critics claimed that he was a saint trying to become a politician, he was in fact a politician trying to become a saint. I was reminded of this remark when reading Sergio Lusato's magnificent book on Padre Pio. Through the life of this small-time priest, small-time and small-town priest, Lusato tells a larger story of modern Italy, where at every turn, spirituality, whether fake or genuine, meets politics, whether idealistic or self-serving. Lusato's book is splendid. The research is staggeringly deep and wide. It embraces runs of archival documents never before consulted and rare books and pamphlets preserved in obscure libraries. The framework is transdisciplinary. This is the work of a historian who knows his anthropology and his political theory. The writing is enviably lucid and never lush, for which the translator, Frederica Randall, surely deserves much credit. Still, the most impressive thing about the book may be the critical detachment of the author. In writing about a saint who may or may not have been a charlatan, Lusato suspends belief but also suspends disbelief. He writes not as an atheist nor as a believer, which means both Richard Dawkins and the Archbishop of Canterbury will be disappointed with his methodology. He writes not as an atheist nor as a believer, but as a scholar who suspends belief and disbelief at the same time. I live in a land crawling with saints, spurious and genuine. But it is not just Indians who should and will read this book. Everywhere except Western Europe, the march of science has been matched by a resurgence of religious belief. There are Padre Pio-like figures, alive or lately deceased, in very many countries in North and South America, in Asia and in Africa. Their stories should be told, for in many cases, they contain the stories of the societies in which these saints or pseudo-saints lived and died. Sergio Lusato.
So I do have a written statement. Ladies and gentlemen, it is for me a real privilege to be here and to be honored as a finalist of the Cundill Prize. I'm sincerely proud of this accomplishment and immensely grateful to the members of the jury, to Professor Guha for his kind words. I don't know whether they were kind, but at least there were some words about my book, and to you all. And also, needless to say, to the distinguished memory of Peter Cundill. Thanks to Professor Guha, you now know a little bit more about Padre Pio than I suspect you knew just a few minutes ago. Should some of you remain skeptical about Padre Pio's capacity to make miracles happen, here is the ultimate evidence. The very fact, the miracle of me being a finalist of the Cundill Prize. On a more serious tone, let me say that the decision of the jury to recognize a book that was originally written in a foreign language and that focuses on a saint intensely worshipped in Italy, but hardly known outside the Catholic world, this decision testifies to the great open-mindedness of the jurors and to the keen interest in all sorts of historical endeavors. By the way, it was with a comparable open-mindedness that my American editor, Sarah Bestel at Metropolitan Books, decided to have my book translated into English. Because, she told me, nobody in America has a clue as to who Padre Pio is. Talking about the translation, I'm so pleased to acknowledge here its author, Ms. Frederica Randall. Frederica is with us tonight and deserves the recognition of excellence as much as I do. If the jury of the Cundill Prize found the story of Padre Pio worth reading, it's mainly because Frederica was able to convey it with an exquisite skill. Finally, I would like to acknowledge, so to speak, the main characters of my book. Padre Pio's devotees. All those Catholic folks that during half a century or so venerated the Capuchin friar as a new incarnation of the Verb. Their faith is not mine. But I learned a lot studying their lives. I learned that history is, before anything else, a search for the unknown, and is ultimately a dialogue with the other from us. Also, I learned that too soon did Max Weber and others conclude, 1 century ago, that the Western world was well on its way towards disenchantment, or secularization, or enlightenment, or however you might want to call it. In fact, insofar as illness, sorrow, evil will perdure among us, human beings, and particularly the most fragile among them, will still need to look at figures such as Padre Pio to get, if not miracles, then at least consolation and hope. Thank you.
I've got a text, and I'm sticking to it. In the Soviet camp of Kozelsk, writes Timothy Snyder, prisoners befriended dogs. Some recited from memory long novels from the Polish realist period. Lonely men wrote home and had to give a sanatorium as return address. When the first few were taken from the camp, all thought they were to be released. Instead, in the spring of 1940, each would be shot, then delivered, probably by truck, in batches of 30 or so, to a mass grave in the Katyn forest. Betrayed by the letters, loved ones would be deported. Among the dead, a woman whose sister the Germans would kill. The retelling of events is simple, but includes a protean irony. The NKVD interrogators at Kozelsk, writes Snyder, lived in the real monastery where Dostoevsky's invented characters mused on what might be permitted to men who'd replaced God with chemistry. Bloodlands is shot through with such ironies and echoes. It's full also of spare intimacy. It has to be. 14 million people were deliberately murdered by 2 regimes over 12 years in the lands between central Poland and Western Russia. This is Snyder's subject, and it's not for the faint of heart. On most of his 414 pages, a man, woman, or child, none a soldier in uniform, is starved to death, shot, or gassed. The challenge is to the soul, but also to the writer. So many lives to betray through error, numbing quantification, or worse. And then there are the rival national memories to contend with. To say something new, and worth saying, moreover, requires a mastery of a staggering, sometimes fractious literature in at least 5 languages. Near where the likes of Primo Levi or W.G. Sebald have trodden, triteness or delusion are hazards for lesser historians. Aristotle voiced the problem around 330 BC. The historian describes what has been, the poet that which might have been. Hence poetry, Aristotle continued, is something more philosophic or graver, of graver import than history. We might beg to differ tonight. Snyder is a forensic archaeologist of a bloody past, but he's also, it turns out, something of a poet in Aristotle's sense. I invite you to read for yourselves Bloodland's Flash of Genius. It involves examining, in a single story, episodes of Soviet and German state murder in the Ukraine, in Poland, in Belarus, that are more often told apart. I do this with a warning. A book that includes in its conclusion, quote, "The image of the German concentration camps as the worst element of National Socialism is an illusion." This is a shattering book to read. It took a resilient spirit to write it. Thank you, Timothy Snyder.
The beauty of having my book introduced so generously and well is that I don't feel that I have to speak about it myself. What I'd like to do instead is to acknowledge some debts. As you can imagine from what you've heard of the book, and perhaps one or two of you have read it, it's not a book which I wanted to write. It's a book which, over the years, as I became a historian of Eastern Europe, I came to feel had to be written. But the passive voice only takes you so far. It's not a book that wrote itself. It's a book that I wrote, but I wrote it with a good deal of help. And if you'll indulge me, I'd like to indicate some of the sources of that support. I want to begin, of course, by thanking the jurors, thanking McGill, acknowledging the support of Peter Cundill for history. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's a great pleasure and it's an honor to be included with Maya and Sergio. I've got both of their books and have made a start. And each of them confirms one of my own amateurish and uninformed opinions about history as a whole. One of those amateurish and uninformed opinions is that the history of the United States really only begins in the 1860s, and that up until that point, it's actually an annex of the history of the British Empire. Another of my uninformed amateurish opinions is that we are not, in fact, in a secular age at all. And these opinions have been confirmed beautifully so far by the beginnings of these books. So I'm very glad to be here and in the company that I am. I want to thank my family and the wonderful public, in the American sense of public school education, that I had, which meant that I understood the Holocaust and both the Holocaust and Soviet crimes to be central events by the time I entered university. I want to thank my teachers at Brown, especially Mary Gluck and Tom Simons. I was able to study East European history as an undergraduate, which is not so often. I left with an Eastern Europe of ideas, of nations, of economics, and power. I want to thank my teachers at Oxford. It was here in the UK that I became a historian, thanks to Timothy Garton-Ash there, thanks to his joint supervisor, Jerzy Jedlicki in Warsaw, who supervised me as a historian of ideas, but as I came to see some of the deeper subjects that would draw me over the years, he became important to me as well in a capacity which he doesn't like to acknowledge, but which became more and more clear, which is as a child survivor of the Holocaust. I want to thank the various people who kept me afloat in the young years of my unemployment in the historical profession, which include Harvard and the Institute for die Wissenschaften von Menschen in Vienna. And I want to thank, of course, Yale, the place where I eventually landed, for its libraries, for its support. I want to thank, in particular, my chair, Laura Engelstein. But there is a longer underlying trajectory to all of this, which has to do with Eastern Europe. This is a book about a territory in Eastern Europe where 14 million people were deliberately murdered over a period of 12 years. It's a book which could not have been conceptualized without time and without languages, without patient friends, colleagues, but also patient friends who helped me to learn the languages. It could not have been written without caring about people who live and about their parents and about their grandparents. It's a place where families almost always have some sort of loss of the kind that is described in this book. But without the banality of time spent, without the banality of durée, I could not have understood how these two regimes overlapped, how the national tellings, although all of them are important, are also all of them insufficient. I had a huge amount of generational luck. My generation was the generation which could go to Eastern Europe. It helps little to know Hungarian or Lithuanian or these difficult East European languages if you can't go to the places, and my generation could. I owe a great deal to archivists as well. People complain about the archives of Eastern Europe being closed, and of course it's true that you have to know the line beyond which, I mean the geographical line, beyond which you have to bring a box of chocolates or whatever it might be. In general, archives are open rather than closed, and we owe a great deal to the archivists. And for a synthesis like this, I owe a huge amount to hundreds of historians who I cannot even begin to mention: Germans and Israelis, Ukrainians and Poles, Russians and Westerners, the older generations who set the parameters of debate, but also the younger generations who have used these archives and have advanced the historiography, especially of the Holocaust, in my opinion, so enormously in the last 20 years. In my own entirely objective opinion, the best of these younger historians is Marcy Shore, whose example in terms of language learning, diligence in archives, but also simple humanity was absolutely indispensable in the writing of this book. I wrote this book while she was pregnant with our first child, who was born a week after I finished. He gave me an extra week. His due date was the day that I submitted the manuscript. I stayed up all night that night to submit the manuscript because the mother of the child had an opinion about when the manuscript should be submitted, which was before the birth of the child. And so I childlessly myself stayed up the whole night and submitted this book about which I've been thinking for 2 decades on that night. But all of this, all of the arguments in the book, all of the treatments in the book about from the famine in Ukraine, the Soviet terror, the Nazi starvation of Soviet prisoners of war, the Holocaust, the crimes better known and less known, all of this is one level of the book. It all rests on a deeper foundation. I tend to think that the very good work, the very important work that's been done in the last 2 decades is a pale, but I hope a faithful echo of much more important work that was done in the 1930s and the 1940s. What do I mean? I mean, and I don't mean this as consolation, only as acknowledgement or recognition, that the 1930s and 1940s were an age of letters. People wrote. A book like this could not have been written without the notes thrown from buses by people who were on their way to be executed outside of Warsaw or outside of Vilnius, without the diaries kept by Polish officers, like those held in Kozelsk, or like the Soviet prisoners of war, 3 million of whom were starved by the Germans, who also kept diaries, without the letters written about the Soviet famine in Ukraine, without, for example, to take maybe the most important example, the entire archive, which was preserved in Warsaw in the ghetto. These are the primary sources which all of us have used and all of us need. Without these written sources, without the belief of their writers that they were writing sometimes not for themselves, not just for their families, but for people who they would not know. They certainly would not know because they generally knew they were going to die in the future. Without this, the book couldn't have been written. This is obviously a debt that I cannot discharge, but I wanted to use my time to acknowledge it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kate, Jeff, Rama. Thank you, Timothy, Maya, Sergio. I now ask Senator Meehan to join me at the podium, and we can reveal winner. Do you have any final words?
No, excitement is rising.
You open the envelope.
You'll read that part, and I'll read this part. All right?
Why don't you do that? Okay, sure.
And the winner of the 2011 Cundill Prize in History at McGill is
Sergio Luzzatto for his book Padre Pio, Miracles in Politics in a Secular Age. And we would also like to congratulate translator Frederica Randall, who will share in the prize, as the rules.
Bravo.
Bravo.
Congratulations, Sergio.
Well done. Thank you so much.
I certainly don't have a written statement for that. No, I'm not going to be able to find words. I'm so surprised, so grateful. And mainly, possibly the only thing I will try to say is that I'm very impressed by again, I used this word a few minutes ago, the open-mindedness of the people involved in this prize. I think that the very fact of, having somebody coming from outside the Anglo-Saxon world is impressive enough. And maybe even the more so in the sense that I come from a country which is Italy, which is, the more and more provincial, so to speak, nowadays. And in this sense, I will try to be, with a very, big pride I feel tonight, I will try to be somehow as an ambassador of such a spirit in my own country. And ultimately, I would try to say that since I live somehow in between different countries in the sense that I teach in Italy, but I live in France, very close to the Swiss border, at least you got 3 times ambassadors, so to speak, in the sense that I will do my best to acknowledge this outside from here in my own living environment. Thank you very much.